US regionals for SCGCon was this past weekend, and Modern was the main format, and coming out at the top with the top 8 being 5 out of 8 of these decks, it's very clear that Underworld Breach is a problem. The combo notably has been banned in both Pioneer and in Legacy, and for some reason is still around in Modern, but actually has been seeing a fair amount of play pre One Ring ban and now more so post One Ring ban. You of course have to bring in the whole idea of Mox Opal being unbanned as well, introducing a faster clock for this deck, but also a potential turn 2 win. The combo itself has taken over also because of Energy being at the top, having a notably bad matchup against combo decks, which is why we see other combo strategies like Ruby Storm still stay at the top, and heck, even the Belcher decks still making their way through in terms of the general metagame. The banning of Breach isn't so much a nuanced discussion. It probably will go at the end of the month, but I think there is a larger discussion to be had around ban cadences and also the idea of metagames in terms of what actually is the problem, and maybe just an overreaction to Breach, which might be a bit of a hot take, but one that I want to run through based on my real life experiences in other games outside of Magic, and how we can kind of bring that in compare and contrast to how Magic's competitive scene, its casual scene, and how its general player base is feeling about an archetype that has just taken over the format. Breach is absolutely dominating US regionals this weekend, already having 5 Breach decks locked in for top 8 with a round to go, and based on the standings should end up at 6 or 7 out of top 8. Next ban list update is on the 31st, which should, you know, be shocked if this deck didn't get hit. I think it's pretty clear that something will get banned out of the Underworld Breach decks. I think Underworld Breach, in my opinion, is the correct hit. I don't think it's Mox Opal at all, because Mox Opal is unfortunately only playable right now in terms of top decks in the Breach deck itself. The other Mox Opal strategies are nowhere near the top. There are some things being quoted later down the line, which I want to try and use as a part of the bulk of this discussion in the video from Nikachu, but that's kind of for further down. Let's kind of lock in the issue here. Now, with something like Breach from the article that just kind of happened here, we have Jesse Robkin that won the event with the Grinding Breach deck, and it actually ended up being a mirror. When it came to that, it ended up being a Breach mirror. Now, when it came to the top 8, we see Grinding Breach versus Breach, Breach versus Titan, Breach versus Breach, and Breach versus Energy. Now, Energy ended up kind of making its way to the top here, but Jesse ended up just taking the clean sweep all the way through when it came to their Breach run in the top 8. But also we see Amulet Titan that tends to have like a decent matchup against like much of the modern metagame spread, with its own like fast clock as well, having a lot of tools in its land-based archetype, like something like the double amulet opener can sometimes be fast enough. We see notably, again, like with lists like this, Jesse Robkin's list having Jace the Wielder Mysteries in the main board and no Thassa's Oracle in the side or in the 75 at all, whereas we see Corey's list having Thassa's Oracle in the main but no Jace across the 75. Notably, the thing I want to note out here is when you look at the metagame spread, Breach is approximately 1/3 of the metagame of day 2, which is absolutely insane. But I also do want to note that some folks were also making the call of playing Dimir Mill. We saw a winner of Pro Tour Lord of the Rings last year taking the win, or not even taking the win, sorry, getting, I believe it was 25th or 26th place with Dimir Mill in a metagame full of Breach. You can imagine that a deck playing more Moxes than some vintage decks, by the way, 4 Mox Opals, 3 Mox Ambers, or sometimes 4 Mox Ambers. You can imagine a card like Tasha's Hideous Laughters is absolutely insane. And with decks like Amulet being the meta call, and, you know, Orzhov Blink being at the top, all 3 of these decks, very good matchups for Mill, by the way, very good. I just want to point that out. If there is a metagame call that you want to make in any one of these top situations or tournaments coming up, Mill is a very good deck if you're able to apply it very well against these top strategies. I mean, Energy is a bad matchup for it. Eldrazi, probably it's closer to 50-50, but probably ends up being like a bad matchup, and the rest of the metagame tends to be very hard. But if the top of the metagame is going to be Titan, Blink, and Breach, you're going to have a very good time with the Hedron Crabber too. So I just wanted to point that out. But when it came to metagame calls, a lot of people were trying to find ways to beat Breach or play Breach. A lot of people were making fun of people for just picking Breach, but it just ends up being the right call. You played the best deck, but in this case, it also is the fastest deck, which is another thing to know when it comes to online play, when it comes to MTGO, when it comes to just playing your leagues and quote unquote going Moto Infinite, or just doing well and trying to get your 5-0s or doing well in tournaments. Breach just ends up being a faster state of play. When it comes to playing something like Control, maybe you're playing Azorius Control, or just I'm looking at some of these other decks in this metagame spread, playing something like Dimir Midrange or Azorius Control, you tend to be playing longer games. For example, you might play like a 40 to 50 minute round of Azorius Control with a little bit of an energy package, or you might be playing Dimir Midrange. But if you play something like Breach, a lot of times you do get very fast games. Your opponent is unable to interact. Sometimes you get that turn 2 win that the deck has been introduced to now with Mox Opal. And so you end up being able to play like 2 to 3 games in the span of your opponent playing 1, which is a very valuable thing to a lot of people just trying to get raw games of Magic in. And this is what you see end up happening in something like Legacy on Pauper right now. In Pauper, you see Burn being at the top of the metagame and other fast strategies like Affinity as well. Combo tends to be really well placed because it tends to be just about how fast you're able to beat your opponent, or just beat their interaction and then beat your opponent. In the Legacy metagame, we see Oops All Spells and Dimir Reanimator having really great kind of win rates overall, especially against Oops All Spells being like any one of like 15 different sideboard options. It feels like it has such a great game 1 win rate. And then in game 2, it could be like one of actually like probably 3 to 4 legitimate sideboard plans that Oops All Spells tends to play these days. And then you have like Dimir Reanimator that tends to actually have really good like combo wins, but also like creature based, like just kind of beat you in the face type of wins. That archetypes like these tend to be speeding up the metagame and making it almost like non-interactive to the point where you just go fast and go fast. And one thing I will say about metagames like this one with Modern, Legacy, and in Pauper right now, I think all 3 of these formats will probably get hit at the end of the month in some way, shape, or form. These actually are, in my opinion, like relatively good times to get into these metagames, because you tend to only require the learning of very few matchups at the top of the metagame. If you tend to get into like high level tournaments or what you're expecting throughout the leagues the majority of the time, you don't have to learn too many matchups. And so you just kind of build your sideboards that way. You get into the whole format with an archetype that you like and just learn from there. And that's why I like these type of moments. I tell people to get in at these type of moments, because when it's fair and widely spread out, it's very hard to learn things. You get into very different matchups, kind of set to set or ban to ban or whatever it might be. You tend to get into very wide open situations where people are just like, oh, I'm going to play Boros Burn because everyone's trying to do something different. So something like a 1-mana 2/2 haste is great, but ultimately Burn's in a really bad spot with certain archetypes at the top. Breach is just faster. Blink actually has some really solid like lifelink options. I don't think Burn can ever beat something like Amulet Titan. I mean, it probably can. I imagine Titan has a relatively decent matchup against Burn as well, from my experience anyway. Maybe it's just the pilots I'm working with, but regardless, all of these archetypes are really fast. They're really broken. They're really fast to play online, so they have that kind of appeal to them. So why isn't anything changes? Why aren't people bothering to adapt? Is everything better when it's broken? Is everything better when it's balanced? Well, what is the competitive balance that we need to go towards? What is the casual experience that we need to cater to? And that's part of the discussion that I want to have today past this discussion, because we see when it comes to the breakdown, this isn't the final breakdown here, but we see this kind of tweet from McWinsauce here, kind of showcasing like, just look at where the standings end up being, right? Like look at where the amount of Breach decks that are just everywhere right now. It's absolutely insane, the kind of win rates, the potential of strategies like this, and where things ultimately line up in terms of like top 8s and how things ultimately line out. I believe this is actually the breakdown going into top 8. It's not obviously the final standing as we saw from the SCG article, but it's crazy that Breach is this far into it. I mean, again, like Pro Tour winner, Pro Tour Lord of the Rings winner ended up actually just kind of registering something like Dimir Mill, and I believe they went 25th or 26th. Head to their Twitter page. I believe I have it bookmarked. I didn't particularly want to highlight it. I just wanted to kind of brag about it, because shout out to Dimir Mill again, in a world where Moxes are everywhere. Tasha's City's Laughter is a really good meta call. But regardless, one of the central things I wanted to discuss in this video is a recent example that I saw in my personal gaming life outside of Magic. I do end up playing these days maybe a little bit of Overwatch, a lot more Rivals, but a comparison where you have a Titan of the industry, right? So follow me on this example here. Titan of the industry, Overwatch, the leader of hero shooters. Nothing could unseat the power that is Overwatch 2 in the subgenre of hero shooters in the shooter genre of gaming. And then Rivals comes along, and due to various factors, I think the recognizability and the mass appeal of Marvel is a big reason for that, but also the lack of competitive balance is something that really drives people to something like Rivals. Overwatch 2 strived on its competitive balance, and that ultimately ended up being a big downfall to it. I've been playing Overwatch 2 since like literally Echo came out in Overwatch 1. I wasn't one of the OGs, but my friends that got me into Overwatch, they were some of the OGs. They've been playing longer than me, but I've been playing for a hot minute. And when it came to Overwatch 2, or Overwatch in general, one of the more frustrating things that happened was when it came to balance changes, the competitive metagame was a big reason that Overwatch made changes. And I think that frustrated a lot of the general player base that didn't necessarily care about the competitive balance. They cared about the playability of their characters, the viability of different archetypes across the hero spread. And so you ended up seeing a lot of these like micro changes, like move speed up by like 10 meters per second, or, you know, damage up by like 1 damage per second, like these really minuscule like micro buffs sometimes that didn't really make any sense whatsoever. But at a competitive level, it created a breakpoint that changed everything. For example, if you increase someone's damage per second by like 5, now it made it so if you headshot them, like this character headshot someone else, that changed the matchup completely, because now you could headshot them with 2 hits versus now if you decreased it by 5 damage per second, you would have to headshot them 3 times. And so stuff like this mattered at the high level, but it didn't really matter at the low level. But now comparatively in Marvel Rivals, every character does something broken. Like legitimately, there are so many broken things happening in the game. They are not striving for any type of competitive success. And if we kind of strive for something like that, then maybe that is where something like Magic needs to go in terms of a direction. The problem is with something like Magic Online and the increase in the amount of challenges. Every single day there's a challenge. Some days there are multiple days with double challenges on them. And so with the increase in the competitive environments over and over and over again, I think we can generally say like in the leagues, like things tend to be pretty spread out. There's a lot of decks that tend to 5-0, but when it comes to competitive data, it's very important to take these challenges, because then there actually is like a concerted 1st through 8th place. You don't really get that in the leagues. In the leagues, you see the spread in terms of what can succeed based on like lucky matchups and the time of day that you're playing and all that type of stuff. But when it comes to challenges, when it comes to tournaments, when it comes to bigger arenas for people to showcase their skill, you see a different spread and people tend to just go with a winning list. And that's why you see in Overwatch, when it comes to competitive games, you tend to see 1-2 lineups. This is where we got the GOATS lineup, the infamous lineup that made Overwatch change its kind of open role queue system to like a role queue specific lock 2-2-2, whereas Rivals is just open queue completely. There are broken lineups. There are really powerful like 3 support lineups. There are concerted things at the top of the metagame, but where the vast majority of the player base is at the middle levels, like kind of gold and plat, where the vast majority of the Magic player base is in the leagues themselves at the LGS level, this may not be a problem because Mox Opals are really expensive. A lot of the top decks are really expensive in terms of some of the pieces that you need. A lot of people aren't playing them, especially when it comes to paper playability, where you don't have rental services like on Magic Online. A lot of people tend to be staying to the same decks that they've been playing for a while. And obviously the grinders, they have like the money and the resources to kind of go through archetypes, or they may kind of balance their lives around kind of making those type of purchases. But when it comes to that mass wide spread appeal, it's not necessarily the balance that a lot of these players care about. They just care about a fun time. They just want to make sure that their archetypes are good. And so this is why I always talk about that at a tier 2 and tier 3 level, Modern always tends to be like pretty spread out. When you get to the LGS level, when you get to the league level, a lot of decks tend to be viable. A lot of decks tend to allow you to go moto infinite, as many people say, where you can go like 3-2 and you can get your 100 ticks, you get your buyback on your league itself. And for that, a lot of people are just happy because you get your buyback, you get a chest. So technically you're up on resources. Maybe you open the chest and you open them crazy foil, or you open like a full set and you are able to redeem that and stuff like that. So Rivals ends up being a more recent bias that tends to be not competitively balanced and tends to be more, right now, I think a lot of people will say is more successful than Overwatch 2. A lot of the content creators have moved over, play both, but that type of success is important for both type of archetypes to make both better. But Overwatch tends to be a titan of the industry, one that kind of paved the way. You know, Overwatch walked so that Rivals can run. And so we shouldn't kind of completely push the wayside competitive balance when it comes to Magic, because there is a large competitive scene. But when you see the trajectory of Magic in general, it tends to be a larger focus on the casual environment. And I'm wondering if that tends to be a better direction for this game, because when it comes to competitive balance in a game like this, a lot of people tend to get frustrated. They go on Twitter, they start arguing. Like, the competitive players will never be happy. There will always be a problematic deck. The meta is just like a random creation of what people think tend to be the best. There are plenty of examples throughout Magic's history of cards and archetypes that shine in random moments because someone randomly decided to play it. I mean, look at the example of 5-color humans that came out of nowhere from a random meme YouTube video and now became a top deck. I mean, look at Orzhov Blink that came out of nowhere out of the recent unbans and just kind of like fully came to realization from there. The modern iteration of what now is Orzhov Blink now, but probably a lot of people see as like Death and Taxes from way back when. There's so many ways to attack this metagame. There's so many ways to adapt to it, especially, again, I do want to highlight Mill again, a lower level archetype that a lot of top players decided to actually play and succeed to in this upcoming metagame, in this past SCG, in past RCs as well. There are ways to adapt to the top of the metagame, and I think a lot of people avoid that because with the whole hullabaloo of like bans and people doing this, people doing that, I think a lot of pros tend to be like the angry people, and they tend to be the voice that a lot of people hear, but not the one that they need. The vast majority of players aren't parroting this. Remember that people on Twitter, people on Reddit, that is the vocal minority of people. And obviously the vast majority of players tend to be commander players now. But when it comes to a casual experience, a lot of people aren't worried about how broken Breach is, even though it is a good deck. Maybe the metagame actually is a lot better than we think. It has the ability to adapt like it has with Overwatch, like it has with Rivals. We do have active problems, but we do have a player base that is able to self-regulate, but chooses not to because of the competitive scene. And maybe the competitive aspect of Magic is what the ultimate problem is, but that's where I'll kind of stay at with the Rivals versus Overwatch compared to Magic discussion. This is the modern metagame right now based on grinding Breach, and the one thing I wanted to highlight here is that grinding station is a problem now. It's almost 15% of the metagame. Energy's at the top as well, and Boros and Jeskai Energy almost take up the same percentage as well. If you really kind of combine the energy decks, I mean, Energy is still more in terms of a percentage than grinding station. Now, obviously, this is also including league data and other tournaments as well. Eldrazi Ramp at the top, Orzhov mid-range, Amulet Titan. I mean, Temur Breach as well, if we kind of include that, I guess it's kind of the same. It might be at the top at that point. But regardless, Breach is at the top right now. It doesn't mean that's a new thing. Because if we use the Wayback Machine, you know, Wayback Machine right now, December 13th, the week before the big ban and unban, the banning of the One Ring and the unbanning of Splinter Twin, Mox Opal, all that stuff. Boros Energy, 25% of the metagame. We needed the One Ring gone. Belcher and Ruby Storm end up, Belcher, Ruby Storm, and Mono Green Basking Root Wall end up being answers to Boros Energy at the top because it has a weak combo matchup. But also, we see here that Grinding Station's at the top as well. Grinding Station was a problem pre-One Ring. It was a problem pre-One Ring ban because it was a combo deck that had a good energy matchup. And so, yes, it's going to be able to play itself, play one of the most busted Magic cards ever printed in Magic's history. And so this is a Grinding Station list from back then. This was kind of November 21st. This was a 5-0 list. But you have the Thassa's Oracle. You have Thunder Trap Trainer, which tends to be a staple in the kind of Belcher decks right now. Synchronous Stupors for some counter spells. You have a little bit of interaction. Flare of Denial. You play Breach. You have the Thassa's Oracle win. You even have the Tameo as well. There are so many reasons why Breach is a busted Magic card in general. It didn't need Mox Opal. Mox Opal sped it up. I don't want to be disingenuous here. Mox Opal definitely helped this deck out so much, but it was a problem pre-ban. And so this is why something like Underworld Breach already being banned in Pioneer and Legacy is something to keep in mind when it comes to the power that it has on current Magic being a game changer as well. There are so many eyes on this card that I think it's time that, like, you know what, we need to just be okay with the fact that some fire design cards should not be in the game anymore. We do not need these cards to exist in formats. And we just need to learn that when it came to fire design, F-I-R-E, by the way, take a Google on that. For those of you not understanding what I'm saying, by the way, take a look. There actually is an article specifically talking about fire design from Wizards of the Coast, talking about how like fun and like excitement and highly interactive or whatever, like really exciting Magic cards was like a key design piece for a lot of them, a lot of design for a number of years. And we had a lot of mistakes come out of that era. I think Throne of Eldraine was like the marquee fire design problem set. That's where we got Oko and Once Upon a Time. Earl was around that time. I believe Earl might have been, was it this set or the one before? Was it Theros Beyond Death? I think it was Theros Beyond Death, but regardless, March 9, 2020, we see, Legacy bans Underworld Breach. Later that year, we see in August, we see the banning of Pioneer. Now, this is around the time, obviously, this was kind of peak pandemic here. No changes were happening in Pioneer. People fell off Pioneer altogether, right? We see Inverter ban. Kethis was banned because it was like kind of like a pre-ban. Kethis wasn't necessarily a problem. More people were playing Inverter of Truth, but Kethis of the Hidden Hand was seen potentially as a problem if the Inverter of Truth deck went away. Walking Ballista and Underworld Breach. All these problematic combo cards that the Pioneer format is unable to answer, which honestly makes it very uninteresting to me. Personally, I'm not trying to play Pioneer unless you print fetch lands into the format or make it legal in the format, or heck, even just make Surgical Extraction legal in the format. I don't care. I am not playing this format. In my opinion, it sucks. If mill is not a viable strategy in this format, the format sucks. That's just what it is. If it's not wide open enough, I don't care, right? So when it comes to a format like this that cannot handle combo at all, of course Underworld Breach is going to be banned. So we see it banned in other formats for various reasons, and it's been a number of years. It has been. So many sets have come. 4 years worth of sets has been out since the banning of this card. And so we ultimately get to this tweet, this wild tweet by Nikachu. Wild tweet that kind of inspired this video. This was the reason I made this video. Modern Grinding Station plays more Moxen than a vintage deck, which I looked up. Is true. Some vintage decks will play less than this. And somehow Breach is the problem? Nikachu, please. Nikachu, my fellow Canadian, please. Please see the light. It's not okay. Oh my lord. Okay. But the issue is, if you take out Underworld Breach, why are there no other decks using Mox as in egregious amounts? You don't see it, not even in Affinity. There's a reason Breach is banned in Pioneer and Legacy. Doesn't really make sense why it would be okay in Modern. As is the history of Mox Opal, players only play the best Mox Opal decks until it's banned, and then they move to the next best one or search for the next best one. Breach has been fine in Modern entire lifetime until What? Breach has been fine in Modern for its entire lifetime until Opal was unbanned because the speed matters is on the future Mox Opal decks. I don't know about this one. We see, okay, I'm not saying that Breach has been a problem for a number of years. Ebbed and flowed. We see its popularity rise pre-One Ring ban. We see that. So it actually was played, and it actually was a legitimate strategy before. Mox Opal sped it up. But this point being brought up about the fact that Mox Opal and Mox Amber, honestly Mox Amber too, in certain ways, don't really see play past this deck is something to note as well. Because there are really easy answers to decks like this. Now, will that change if we ban Energy, if we ban Breach, maybe something else, I don't know, and we unban something else? Will Mox Opal still be a problem? My guess is if we continue to make good unban calls, I don't think they will, because in this deck specifically, yes, Mox Opal is at the top, but Mox Opal is not at the top in other strategies necessarily. We have Energy being held up by the siloed design of Modern Horizons 3. We have Modern Horizons 3 being the reason for the Eldrazi deck being at the top. And yes, it is. The Soul Land. You cannot deny the power of a Soul Land in Modern that can be used by the Eldrazi decks. That Soul Land is very powerful. Okay. And then we have Psychic Frog holding up the Frog type decks. The Blink decks are actually really cool. Honestly, in my opinion, the Blink decks has a lot of, like, they have like the MDFCs and stuff, which is something to note. They use the kind of other Modern Horizons cards and the free elementals, the ephemerate, like all that stuff. There are other aspects to that deck, but it actually ends up being like a relatively unfair strategy that combines a lot of random mid-range pieces and value that ends up getting there. It's like a lot of bad cards, in my opinion, coming together to just do good things. A Blink is actually really cool in terms of an archetype. Is it broken? I don't think so. Does it do broken things? Yes, sometimes. I think it's perfectly fine when it comes to something like that. Breach is a real problem for sure. Simply the fact that it is banned in every format except Modern indicates that. To think it further, without Breach, what's the most scary thing that deck can do? Make a construct on turn 2, I guess. Mox is strong, but Breach is 2 mana, I win. Okay, I have a question then. If Breach was such a problematic card in Modern, why weren't people calling for its banning in November 2024 when it had a meta share of 1.5 to 4%? Is that a problematic meta share? Like the whole premise of the post is that Breach and Archetype has been docile tier 2 to tier 3 most part of the past 5 years. Opal gets added to the deck and skyrockets in meta share. Nothing else in the deck has changed. How can we really put BAM? Okay, so now this is a fair argument. I will say when you word it like this, it's a fair argument. Being banned everywhere is not an argument. That's also fair. I can, even though that was the argument that I was posing, I can also understand the flaw in that argument. So that's fair as well. A card's power level is very format dependent. Expressive iteration is also banned in a lot of formats, but for modern players, it can be a little bit clunky. That's fair as well, because you don't have that kind of Delver, 1 mana, protect the threat, expressive iteration value that you get. When it comes to an argument like this, it becomes an inevitability problem that I think the format piece is ignoring. If other formats are banning Underworld Breach, that means that they're likely, in my opinion, this is my argument posed, that there is likely an inevitability problem of there eventually being a card that breaks Underworld Breach. Now what we did is we sped that up. We unbanned Mox Opal and we sped that up. The inevitable card that we ban ends up being something like something like Underworld Breach, because it ends up being a graveyard payoff and a combo payoff that's absolutely insane that would eventually get banned. I think Underworld Breach, I think it's disingenuous to think Underworld Breach wouldn't get eventually banned because of how it's used in the other formats. Heck, if Pioneer is even banning it, right? And I think in a format where you don't even have fetches in there, very few from what I see graveyard interactions, and a deck that is still able to use Underworld Breach in a metagame where you cannot answer combo. In this metagame, I would argue that the problem is the players themselves. I think players lack the ability to adapt, also forced by the factor of Underworld Breach leads to fast wins and rewards skilled pilots. I think the problem is the modern player base at the top. They will just play the best thing, but also there is a lack of adaptation to answer that. Instead of answering what's at the best, it probably is statistically better just to play the best thing, but it doesn't mean that you also can't answer the best thing by playing other metagame calls to be able to answer that. This is just me advocating for Mill, if I'm going to be honest here, but even Drew Buchanan here, they really don't. You didn't have 5 Moxen draws like Vintage can. It also takes a non-zero amount of work to turn them on. Opal is fine if you aren't casting it 15 times in one turn. But when you combo with Breach, you cast Opal and float the mana 15 times in a turn. What are you talking about? What are you talking? What is this? You're saying the same thing. You're casting Opal 15 times. What are you talking about? But anyway, I'm exaggerating that it's actually a vintage deck. Obviously, it's strictly worse Moxen, but it's still fast enough to get a turn ahead of the competition for free wins. I don't know about free wins. There's still decks that can interact with it, but of course, skilled pilots will be able to work around it. I don't know about free wins. I think this is, I think we have to take a look at the fact that these are some of the best players out there. They're at the top of their game in terms of the top metagame. We are rewarding top players for making top decisions. If these top players also made top decisions with other decks, my argument would be that they could also just as easily succeed with this. Like the Breach deck could still win, but we could see a more wide open top 8 percentage, top 8 metagame share if other top players picked up other archetypes, because I think it's the decision making that Modern rewards versus necessarily the decks that are going with it. And again, I think it's because the speed of the deck, the amount of games that you can play per time, the amount of time you put into it is also rewarded when it comes to a fast combo deck. I'm not a modern player, but as a vintage player, what are other decks that all play Moxen and Breach doesn't get banned? You know, whatever. Nothing yet. There's no incentive to build one because Breach exists. The thing with Amber is that it has been exploited in a deck that runs copies of Tamiyo. Yeah, so Tamiyo is probably the recent reason why this deck is actually possible. I don't think this deck actually makes any sense without Tamiyo. Like, I guess you could play Ragavan, but like, even with Ragavan, like you create a treasure token. I guess it could work with Ragavan, but also like the part of it is the fact that like Tamiyo being blue, pitching to certain options, but also depending on different iterations of the strategy, but also Tamiyo flipping into a planeswalker in the mid game is also very relevant. I am always going to build up the meme example of the fact that flipped Tamiyo answer Splinter Twin because the +1 makes it so the general answer of the 1/4 with flash can never kill the player because all attacking creatures that attack you or planeswalkers you control get -1/-0. Just saying, it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny. But I don't know. I guess Ragavan could work. It also works with the idea of some of the removal that the deck already plays. But I think like Tamiyo just like edges out in the longer games, which tend to be what those games ultimately like line up on. It tends to be longer games. If you can flip Tamiyo, that's where you want to be. I think Mox was unbanned for a mix of nostalgia and Watsu realizing it's still probably too strong. I'd like to see a Breach ban for the reason Rafi mentioned above. 2-mana Yogg Wills is inherently broken. However, I understand if Moxopal gets rebanned instead. I'm pretty sure Moxopal is going to be around for quite a while and forever from here. The consequences of Opal Legal will probably be getting a lot more cards banned in exchange for Opal players enjoying the power of uninteractive turn 2 kills. Okay, here's my thing here though. When it comes to what Modern Horizons 2 has been, Modern Horizons 2, Modern Horizons 3, Modern Horizons 1 has been doing to the format, we are past the point of balancing things. This is why I wanted to make the Overwatch versus Rivals kind of comparison here. We're past that point. We are in Marvel Rivals. We have actually made Overwatch into Marvel Rivals. It is now in an unbalanced state of everything. We will never be able to find competitive balance in Modern, in my opinion. So in my opinion, we should just go the Rivals route and just keep everything unbalanced. Unban more cards. It ends up being more fun for the vast majority of player bases. The vast majority of people that do not attend these SCGs or do not care if they top 8 or whatever, they're just here to vibe, they're just here to have fun. They play a variety of different formats, they play different, they're not just stuck at the competitive edge. We should not be building Magic just for competitive players. The competitive balance of the game does matter. We can't just have one thing being the most broken thing in the world. But when it comes to the experience of the vast majority of players, I believe that there are ways to answer this, and I think the modern format still rewards competitive decision making for the top players, but also these top players can do better to adapt also to how the vast majority of the middle of the player base in the modern format and other formats are playing. I think those players also need to have their voices heard, although they may not be speaking the loudest. The vocal minority on Twitter and on Reddit also have their problems in terms of how they view the format. They have their own biases. I think this ends up being a content creator bias raw game problem. When it comes to players like Nikachu, when it comes to players like myself, we're content creators, and so we end up playing on average like a raw amount of games more than the average player. Me myself, I tend to be playing about 3 to 4 games of Commander a week, probably anywhere between 10 to 15 games of Modern per week as well. So that's like about 2 to 3 leagues, a little bit of Arena as well. I tend to play a lot of Magic. I would think on average for the average person, that's a lot of Magic. 50, like 20 to 25 games. If you're playing Arena, I play a lot of Best of One as well. I don't know if you consider that a game. So maybe let's just average it to about 20 to 25 games, like actual individual games of Magic per week. That's a lot of Magic. And a lot of content creators will play a lot more based on the amount of leagues that they play. And so these players tend to see a lot of higher percentage of the metagame. And so they tend to be jaded by a lot more of what they see. They will see, the bad matchups they come up against. They'll try and adapt to that. But when it comes to the average player base, they're not playing as much and they're happy with where they are. That's where Magic is being played. And I think therein lies the problem in an opinion like this. It's kind of ignoring the underlying issue that, like, would Mox Opal be a problem if it wasn't expensive, right? Modern Grinding Station feels like a deck that's like unapproachable because a lot of people can't even play it. The average player base can't even touch the deck because of how expensive it is. They can't get across from it. They always feel like they're up against a grinder, the person that on average has more time and money to spend on a game of Magic, to spend on a deck of Magic. And those people tend to be the people on average, I would think, that put more time and effort into that. And so they tend to be better on average. Whereas you don't have the bad Breach players necessarily, unless you're online where you can rent these decks. You don't have those type of players that, then can play the deck and see the flaws in it and maybe try and answer it. I think this ends up being ultimately a metagaming problem. You're giving the best players access to the best decks, but we are not giving the worst players access to the best decks because of pricing and lack of availability. We unbanned Mox Opal without addressing the reprint problem. We're never going to see a reprint of this card anytime soon at like a rare level. And it needs to be in like like we're not going to see this in like a standard legal pack, right? The price of packs are just going up. We're going to see this in like a master set printed at Mythic. We're never going to see a proper reprint of Mox Opal. And that is my number one criticism with this card. It's not the power of Mox Opal. It's the accessibility of Mox Opal. I think if Mox Opal was more accessible to more people, I think a lot of people could touch it. A lot more people could be playing with it. We could see the flaws of it. We could then see if it ends up being a wider problem. We could then maybe see the popularity of different Mox Opal decks increase, because we could see the 1-for-1 of paper players and kind of online players playing more Affinity, playing more other types of strategy, and see truly if Mox Opal ends up being a problem. But I think it's not the fact that Mox and the power of Mox is bad. I think, having the modern format, having an identity past Modern Horizons is important, but we're also past that, because now Modern's identity is Modern Horizons. And in a world of unbalanced Magic, we should give a lot more players access to the play pieces that they have. Just like in Marvel Rivals, everyone can play any character, but they will choose to play certain ones that are fun. Just like in Marvel Rivals, you have the DPS problem. A lot of people just play DPS and they only play DPS. And unfortunately, if you only play DPS in Marvel Rivals, I'm sorry, I'm just going to rip off the Band-Aid here. You're the problem. You are the problem. You yourself are the reason why you aren't ranking up. Okay. If you're a hard stuck gold player and you only play DPS, that you're the problem. You suck. That's your problem. You are hard stuck there. And some people are okay with that, but some people are stuck in the mentality of they can't grow. They can't improve as a player. They're stuck on only one archetype. And so this is where, you get the pro players that are able to, kind of have that variety, learn and have access to these tools, whereas the average Marvel Rivals player may only have a certain amount of time for a certain amount of games, just like the average Magic player might have a certain amount of time for a certain amount of games. And so they're stuck on one archetype. They aren't able to see past kind of the wider breadth of what's going on. And so they might listen to the top content creators in Marvel Rivals, and the average Magic player might listen to the top content creators in Magic, and a lot of them are telling them something like Breach. Someone like Nikachu is telling them something like Breach is not the problem, it's actually Mox Opal, when they're actually not able to play the amount of games to kind of create their own opinion about the format. It's not Mox Opal, it's Grinding Station. Not Grinding Station, sorry. It's now I can't even speak. It's not Mox Opal, it's Underworld Breach. Underworld Breach is a broken combo card. It is a product of Fire Design, an old design of Magic that we do not need to bring back. We are past that point. We are past the point of no return. Let's not print anymore. Modern Horizons will just be this format rotating set that happens every couple of years. That is where the format is, and we need to really open our eyes to what the real problem is. And I think that's where Saffron Olive's tweet ultimately lands up here. Despite breaking Breach, which is fairly predictable, I think the modern unbans were overwhelmingly positive, and I hope we get more regularly. And I agree. I agree. I think more unbans is better. I think more broken things is better. We do not need to completely design things for competitive aspects. I think combining things for the unbanning and curating experiences for the general player base that is not just top 8ing at RCs is important, because even in constructed play, it's not just about being competitive. Sometimes it's about the gathering too. I think that's what a lot of constructed players forget. The constructed experience is also about the gathering. It's not about winning top 8s. It's not about comp REL the whole time. It's about going to the LGS. It's about playing with your friends, going through a couple rounds, winning some credit. Maybe you buy a card, maybe you buy a foil, and then you just vibe there. That's where you're at. Now, obviously at your LGS, if it tends to be more competitive, if you have some stompers, that tends to be something else. But that also in and of itself is a problem of lack of accessibility. Other people are not able to buy other decks because it's not accessible to do so. It costs an arm and a leg to buy a play set of Mox Opal. In Canada, it's like $1,000. The Canadian dollar is poo-poo caca, right? It's like $1,000 to buy a play set of Mox Opals. And so when it comes to decks like that, if they're not accessible for the average player, then what are you even supposed to do when you want those players to adapt and play other strategies? When you want them to not complain, if they're not able to get into other archetypes, or the analogy being in Marvel Rivals or in Overwatch, if they're not able to get into other heroes due to lack of accessibility and, the fact that they get completely stomped on. So in Overwatch, where it's all about competitive balance, if you play another character, if you play another tank, you play another support, all of a sudden you're not able to put your healing output out there. As a tank, you just have not enough HP. The other tank just feels like they have infinite HP. Then you're just not going to have fun with your deck, with your archetype. But in the analogy of Marvel Rivals, if you make everything more accessible, open things up, allow everything to be broken, allow every player to approach every character, just like in Magic decks, then maybe if the price was a little bit better, maybe if we had a better reprint policy, we could allow everything to be broken. We could allow everything to be more fun, because on average, it's about the average play experience. If we allow other players to try different archetypes and try different strategies and try different cards that might open things up for them to explore Magic in a different way, have new avenues to answer the problems that are coming across from them, and metagaming can be a more appropriate answer versus going on Twitter and just complaining about I don't know, top 8 the metagame or whatever. Anyway, this is where my ultimate rant ended up. I guess this video ended up being like 40 minutes. Oh my God. I'm sorry. I think I ended up like yapping at a point, but I hope y'all enjoyed what I had to say here. Sometimes I might be off course. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Maybe I'm just completely out of my mind here when it comes to something like this, but I love the modern format. I do. I still do love the modern format. There have been times where I haven't, but especially with the unbans, I've had a largely positive outlook on the modern format, and I just want to see that continue. And I think there's ways to do it, and I hope Wizards of the Coast makes the right action and the right choices come the end of this month.